When my family moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, I was filled with a reluctant curiosity. It stood alone, surrounded by brittle hedges that seemed to shrink away from the path leading up to it, as if the house itself rejected them. The previous tenant, I'd heard from my parents' hushed conversations, had passed away not long before. They mentioned it in fragments, words too soft for me to understand clearly, but I had caught enough to feel a prickle of unease. The house was large but quiet, almost too still. It had the worn look of an empty place, its wooden floors smooth from use yet devoid of warmth. The walls were the color of sand left too long under a harsh sun, dull and muted. Each room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. The only place that seemed different, though, was the narrow hallway outside my bedroom. On our first evening, as I settled in, I noticed it. In the dim light, there was a shadow on the wall near the hallway. It was odd, not quite the shadow of a person, not quite the shape of an object. It stood there, unmoving, almost blending in with the wallpaper. I brushed it off as a trick of light, something cast by the angle of the nearby window. But the shadow returned the next night, and the night after that. It never seemed to move, but each time I passed it, I felt a strange pull, as if it wanted to be noticed, wanted me to see it. One evening, I decided to touch the wall. Maybe I could figure out what was casting that shape. My fingers traced the cold surface, feeling for any imperfection or irregularity. But there was nothing. I moved my hands slowly, tracing the edges of the shadow itself, my fingers dipping into the darkness. There was no reason for it to be there, no logical source for that vague outline. And yet it stayed. After that, I began to feel its presence more sharply. The sensation was subtle but unyielding, an awareness that stayed with me even after I'd turned away. I knew the shape was there, just waiting. I didn't mention it to my family. It felt foolish to tell them about a shadow. They would laugh, or worse, they would worry. But every night, the shadow grew more distinct. I began to sense that it wasn't just a figure on the wall. It was something or someone caught between being there and being forgotten. And with every passing night, it seemed to remember itself a little more. The next morning, I approached the hallway carefully, half hoping the shadow had disappeared. I told myself it was just a strange illusion, a dark spot in a badly lit corner of an old house. But it was there, silent and still, as though it had every right to exist within the walls that held it. I stared at it, trying to make sense of the shape, as if studying it might force it into something ordinary. It was peculiar. There were no windows nearby, no odd angles that would cast a shadow in that part of the hall. My mind began to wander, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and old, half-forgotten rumors I'd heard about the house. People in town had always spoken of it with a strange respect. It was a quiet place, they'd say, as if silence were something earned rather than natural. For the first few days, I managed to keep myself busy, brushing aside my thoughts of the shadow. But no matter what I did, no matter where I turned, my gaze kept drifting back toward that wall. In the afternoons, I would catch myself lingering near it, as if I expected the shape to move, to shift, to offer some kind of explanation. It wasn't until the end of the week, while standing in the hall in the evening light, that I noticed something different. The shadow seemed darker, its edges sharper, as if it had grown bolder in my presence. I felt, strangely, like it was waiting for me, and that this waiting was intentional. And then, as I looked away, I felt something, a chill, like a brush of air. I glanced around, expecting to see my mother or father, but there was no one there. Only the house itself, settled and silent. I knew it was absurd, but I felt an impulse to speak, as though the shadow was listening, as though it expected something from me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The silence that followed was thick, as if the house had absorbed the sound entirely, refusing to give it back. Nothing happened. The shadow remained fixed, unmoving, unaffected by my words. But something in me shifted, a slight unease that sat just beneath my skin. The feeling lingered, refusing to be dismissed, a growing awareness that I was no longer alone. That night, lying in bed, I tried to reason with myself. I imagined the shadow as nothing more than a quirk of the house, a harmless oddity in a place that hadn't yet become familiar. But as the hours passed, I found myself listening to the silence, the kind that seemed to deepen as night settled around me. And just as I began to drift into sleep, I felt a soft weight settle on the edge of my bed, the kind of weight that shifts the air ever so slightly, as though someone had taken a seat there, waiting. The next morning, I woke up with the lingering sensation of that weight on my bed, as though it had somehow imprinted itself into the fabric. I tried to shake it off as I got ready for the day, but each movement seemed heavier, every corner of the house more watchful. I avoided the hallway at first, a faint dread settling into me as I went about my morning routine. But the pull of the shadow was relentless, tugging at my attention with the quiet persistence of something that had waited too long to be seen. By midday, I found myself drawn back to it, an unwilling participant in whatever silent agreement the shadow had decided we shared. Standing there, I studied it more carefully with a mix of apprehension and defiance. The shadow was sharper now, its outline taking on the suggestion of a shape, a shoulder, a head, something almost human. Yet it was still just an impression. My hand twitched as though reaching out to touch it, to test if it was solid, if it would resist or give way under my fingers. But I kept my distance, unwilling to feel that chill again, that strange sensation that told me this was more than a play of light. Days passed and I began to sense a rhythm to it, a pattern. The shadow would appear every evening, just as the last light dipped below the horizon, as though it needed the cover of dusk to materialize. And each night, I would find myself looking for it, my heartbeat quickening with a strange anticipation I couldn't quite understand. Then, one evening, as I lingered in the hallway longer than I should have, I heard a faint sound, a soft creak, like a footstep pressed into an old floorboard. I froze, my eyes locked on the shadow, seemed to pulse just once, as though it had taken a single breath. My throat tightened, and I took a slow step back, but my gaze remained fixed on it, drawn to the way it seemed to expand and contract, almost alive. I turned to leave, but something held me in place. A feeling, quiet but insistent, that the shadow was reaching out, attempting to communicate. I couldn't explain it, but the impression was clear, like a word whispered just beyond hearing, a message left for me to decipher. That night, the sensation of weight on my bed returned. I lay stiff and silent, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The feeling was stronger now, almost tangible, as though the presence wanted to be acknowledged, to be known. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every nerve in my body was attuned to it, to the quiet, expectant press of something waiting in the dark. I dared to open my eyes, just a sliver, expecting to see nothing. But there, at the edge of the bed, was the faintest suggestion of a shadow, darker than the surrounding night. It held its place, unmoving, a silent figure, as though watching me. The room was silent, yet I felt a weight to that silence, as if words were being spoken without sound, ideas communicated without form. And for the first time, I felt that the house itself was listening, aware of this quiet exchange between me and the shadow. It was then I understood. The shadow wasn't simply there. It was watching with a patience that went beyond understanding. And though it hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, I knew it had begun to remember itself, its place, its purpose. Over the next few days, the house became quieter, as if holding its breath. The usual creaks and groans of old would faded, replaced by a silence that felt layered, dense. I could almost hear it pressing in around me, filling the empty rooms, sinking into the walls. My family went about their lives, seemingly unaffected, their voices muffled as though the house itself had begun to swallow sound. And yet I felt watched, not only from the shadow in the hallway but from every corner, every darkened room. It was as though the house was reawakening, stretching itself into corners I hadn't noticed before, as if it had begun to remember something lost and wanted me to remember it too. One afternoon, I was alone, wandering the house, hoping the sunlight would ease my mind. As I moved through the rooms, I felt the stillness tighten around me, a gentle reminder of the shadow's presence. When I reached the hallway, I froze. The shadow was there, bolder than ever, its outline clearer, almost defined. The rough shape of a man, standing with a silent patience. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was familiar. I didn't know how or why, but something in my mind whispered that I had seen it before, maybe in a dream or an old memory buried deep within me. Without realizing it, I spoke aloud. "Who are you?" The words hung in the air, unanswered, but the silence seemed to deepen, as though the house itself had paused, waiting. I stayed there, searching the shadow for any sign, any flicker of recognition, but it remained still, unmoved, as if my question were nothing but a whisper lost in the void. That night, the presence returned to my room, heavier than before. I felt it settle near me, just at the edge of my bed, and I could almost sense a kind of longing, a faint desperation. It was as if it needed something from me, something I couldn't name. The days blended into each other, the shadow a constant fixture in my life, a silent companion. I grew used to its presence, almost comforted by it, though I knew that comfort was strange, misplaced. I didn't dare tell my family. How could I explain the sensation of being haunted by something that had no name, no face? Then, one evening, as I was drifting off to sleep, a memory came to me, soft as a feather brushing against my mind. I saw the shadow, not on a wall, but as a figure, standing in the corner of a dim room, its features blurred, forgotten. And with it came a whisper, a name just out of reach, like a fragment of a song half remembered. The name dissolved before I could grasp it, slipping through my thoughts like water, leaving only the faintest trace. But that trace lingered, a hint of recognition that filled me with an unexpected dread. Whoever this shadow was, it had once belonged to someone the house had chosen to forget. And now, piece by piece, it was reclaiming its place. The next morning, the sense of that forgotten name lingered with me, clinging to my thoughts like dust that refused to be brushed away. I was drawn to the idea that there might be something, anything that could tell me who or what had left this shadow behind. And so, driven by an uneasy curiosity, I began exploring the house, my fingers tracing the walls and shelves as though searching for hidden clues. In the smallest upstairs room, where faint traces of someone else's life lingered in the worn wood and faded wallpaper. I found an old, dusty chest tucked into a corner. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly, feeling as though I were trespassing in a place that didn't want to be disturbed. The chest groaned open, and I coughed as a cloud of dust rose from its depths. Inside, I found a collection of items that seemed carefully packed away. A weathered pair of gloves, an embroidered handkerchief, and beneath them, a small portrait in a tarnished silver frame. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age, of a young man dressed in simple, formal clothing. He wore a solemn expression, his eyes seeming to look past the viewer, as if his mind were lost somewhere far away. There was something haunting about his gaze, an air of sorrow that seemed to match the shadow that had taken root in our home. Turning the photograph over, I found a name scrawled faintly in faded ink. Edwin. The name rang faintly familiar, though I couldn't place it, and an uncomfortable sense of recognition settled over me. I could almost imagine the shadow taking on a new form, its outline sharpened by the suggestion of a forgotten face. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Edwin. The name echoed in my mind, mingling with the shadow's presence that, as always, lingered in the hallway, quietly watching. The knowledge of its name made it feel somehow more real, more insistent, as if by knowing it, I had crossed an invisible line. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the telltale weight at the edge of my mattress. It didn't disappoint. The heaviness returned, but it felt different, more focused. I whispered, barely able to say the name aloud, "Edwin?" The air seemed to shift, a faint stirring around me, like the soft rustle of fabric, though I couldn't see or hear a thing. A strange feeling crept over me, a sensation that the house itself had recognized the name, that it was awakening from a long slumber. In my mind, I could almost hear it breathing, a deep, patient exhale, as if the walls were relieved to remember what they had once chosen to forget. The days that followed felt stranger, as though the entire house had been imbued with a new awareness. Edwin's name was ever present, lingering in my mind and, somehow, in the spaces of the house. My family still went about their lives, oblivious, yet to me, every room felt filled with a quiet tension, a sense that something was waiting. It wasn't until I passed the hallway one evening, catching sight of the shadow as it seemed to stand taller, that I realized what it wanted. The shadow was still unyielding, but it felt as though it were asking, "Don't forget me. Remember who I was." And just then, I knew with a cold certainty that I could never turn back. In the following days, Edwin's presence became undeniable. His name had altered something essential within the house, like unlocking a door that had long been bolted shut. Rooms that had once felt familiar now seemed foreign, as if I had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. Shadows grew deeper, stretching in strange ways, and every creak or groan of the floor seemed imbued with a purposeful weight, as though Edwin were pacing unseen, marking his return. I began catching glimpses of something in my periphery, a flash of movement, the briefest glimpse of a figure slipping just out of sight. Each time, my pulse quickened, my heart leaping into my throat as I whirled around, only to find an empty hallway or a quiet, still room. But the feeling never left me. Edwin was there, just beyond my reach, watching and waiting with a patience that felt as ancient as the house itself. One evening, I lingered by the portrait I'd found in the chest, studying Edwin's face in the dim light of a single lamp. The young man stared back at me, his eyes carrying that haunting sorrow, as if he knew something he could never share. I wondered who he had been, why his life had ended so abruptly, and why, of all people, he had chosen me to carry his memory. "Who were you?" I whispered, as if the photograph might somehow respond. But the room held its silence. That night, sleep was a distant prospect. I lay awake in bed, feeling the air grow heavier around me, an almost suffocating stillness filling the room. I could sense him there, lingering in the shadows. When I finally drifted off, it was only to be woken by a strange noise, a faint shuffling, as if someone were moving just outside my door. I lay frozen, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft but insistent, a brushing against the wooden floor. For a long time, I didn't move, afraid that even the slightest sound might break whatever fragile truce kept Edwin from crossing the threshold. Finally, I sat up, summoning all my courage. "Edwin?" My voice was barely above a murmur, thick with sleep and fear. The noise stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was so deep it felt as though the entire house were holding its breath. Then, in the stillness, I heard it, a soft, low whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls. It was unintelligible, just the faintest murmur of something I couldn't quite make out, but it filled me with a deep, gut-wrenching unease. The feeling that I was trespassing, that I was an intruder in my own home, washed over me with brutal clarity. In the days that followed, Edwin's presence grew more insistent. My family seemed unaware, but to me, every shadow, every corner, felt like it held his watchful gaze. Objects began to move in small, unsettling ways. Books shifted on shelves, doors that I'd closed were suddenly ajar, and the faint impression of footsteps marked the dust in the seldom-used rooms. Each time I entered the hallway, I found the shadow lingering, taller and darker, as though Edwin were slowly reclaiming himself piece by piece. It was as if he were preparing, waiting for some final act, and I couldn't escape the feeling that he was inviting me to witness it. At night, his whisper grew louder, more defined, though I could never quite make out the words. It was like listening to a voice submerged in water, muffled, distant, but filled with a quiet urgency. I knew he was trying to tell me something, a message hidden within that persistent murmur, but fear kept me from drawing too close, from risking what lay just beyond my understanding. The house felt like a stranger's now, a place ruled by a presence I could neither see nor control. And yet, despite my terror, I couldn't resist the pull Edwin exerted over me, the sense that he had chosen me as the keeper of his story, the one who would remember what the house had tried to forget. And as his shadow grew darker and more defined, I realized with a mounting dread that there was no turning back. Edwin would not rest until he was fully seen, fully known, and I was the one who would bring him into the light. Edwin's presence, once subtle and unsettling, now loomed over every corner of the house. His shadow no longer seemed content to linger in the hallway. It crept closer, stretching and shifting, as though trying to break free from the constraints of a mere silhouette. Every night, I lay in bed, alert to the faint sounds of movement, the creak of a floorboard, the faint scrape of something brushing against the wall. And each morning, I found new signs of his silent persistence. Objects moved, rooms left colder and feeling oddly vacant, as if he had spent hours there, rehearsing his return. I had tried to ignore it, to convince myself that whatever I felt was a figment of my imagination, a shadow cast by some deeply buried fear. But Edwin would not allow himself to be forgotten. He was patient, relentless, and the weight of his presence had settled over me like a mantle I couldn't shed. He wanted me to remember him, to understand what the house itself seemed so eager to keep hidden. Driven by a mounting sense of urgency, I found myself returning to the small upstairs room, searching for answers in the remnants of his life. I was almost drawn to it, as though the room itself were calling me back, whispering of secrets waiting to be uncovered. And one quiet afternoon, I found them. Folded letters, yellowed with age, tucked carefully into the back of an old dresser drawer. The letters were brittle, nearly crumbling beneath my touch. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink faded but still legible. My fingers trembled as I read the first lines, recognizing Edwin's name among a scattering of affectionate phrases, like fragments of a life I could only glimpse. They spoke of plans, of a future that had once seemed bright and certain, and as I read, I began to piece together a story of love and loss, a life that had been cut short in ways I could only guess at. One letter, written in a shaky hand, caught my attention. It spoke of regret, of a feeling of being watched, and of a profound loneliness that had taken hold of Edwin in his final days. He had felt abandoned, cast aside by the very walls that had once sheltered him. It was as if the house itself had turned on him, casting him out even as he remained within its bounds. And now it seemed he had returned, lingering in the shadows, waiting for someone to bear witness to his story. The room felt thick with silence as I read, the words pressing down on me like a weight I could barely carry. I felt as though I were being drawn into Edwin's sorrow, as though his despair were reaching out to me, wrapping around me in tendrils of regret and longing. I couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with him, an understanding of the loneliness that had plagued him, the desperation to be seen, to be known. I took the letters back to my room that night, unable to leave them behind. I felt as though they were a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting me to something vast and unseen, a story that stretched beyond the limits of my understanding. And as I lay in bed, clutching the letters to my chest, I felt a presence settle beside me. A weight on the mattress, familiar yet more intense, as if Edwin were drawing closer, pressing his silent plea into the fabric of my skin. In the stillness, I heard his whisper again, clearer this time, a voice that seemed to rise from the very walls around me. "Remember me," it murmured, the words soft but insistent, carrying a weight of sorrow that left me breathless. It was no longer just a shadow, a presence lurking in the dark. It was Edwin himself, reaching across the boundaries of time and memory, seeking something I could barely comprehend. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his presence settle deeper, and for the first time, I whispered back, "I remember." The room grew colder, the silence deepening until it felt almost alive, and I knew, with a certainty that left me trembling, that Edwin had heard me. After that night, Edwin's presence became something I could no longer dismiss or ignore. He was there, a silent companion, woven into the fabric of each day. The house itself felt different, as though it had finally awakened, its walls breathing with a watchful awareness. Every corner, every hallway, seemed to bear traces of him, small imprints of his life, his sorrow, his desire to belong. I walked through the house with a strange reverence, careful to tread lightly, as if I were the visitor, the uninvited guest. I tried to go about my days as usual, but it was impossible to escape the feeling of being observed. His presence hovered, almost tangible, as though Edwin himself were standing just behind me, watching. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow, a barely there shift in the light, and each time, my heart would leap, only to fall when I turned and found nothing but empty air. He was just beyond reach, a lingering touch I could never quite grasp. One afternoon, driven by a need to understand him, I ventured back to the small room where I'd found the letters. I knelt by the dresser, searching its dark recesses for anything I might have overlooked. And there, in the very back of the drawer, my fingers brushed against a thin, leather-bound notebook, hidden behind a loose panel. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, the pages fragile with age. I opened it carefully, and the faint scent of dust and ink filled the air. A ghost of Edwin's past. The pages were filled with his thoughts, his fears, written in a hand that grew shakier, more desperate as I flipped through the entries. He wrote of the house's silence, of the strange feeling that had overtaken him, as though he were slowly disappearing, becoming one with the shadows. He spoke of a creeping isolation, an emptiness that seemed to seep into his very bones, making him feel less and less like himself. In one entry, scrawled hastily, almost illegibly, Edwin wrote of an overwhelming need to be seen, to be acknowledged. He felt as though he had become invisible, a shadow that no one could see or hear. "I am still here," he'd written, the words etched deep into the paper. "But no one sees me. No one knows I'm here." The words struck me with a force that left me breathless. It was as though he had anticipated this moment, this encounter with someone who would one day stumble upon his words, his memories. I could feel the weight of his loneliness, his desire to be remembered, to have his life matter in some way, no matter how small. And I knew, without a doubt, that he had found his way back here to remind me, to leave an imprint of his existence on someone willing to bear witness. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a shift in the air around me. Not a chill or a breeze, but a faint, pulsing warmth, like the ghost of a touch. It was gentle, almost comforting, as though Edwin were reaching out, his presence a whisper of reassurance. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to feel it fully, to let his presence settle over me like a shroud, binding me to his memory. But the peace was short-lived. As the hours passed, the warmth grew, intensifying until it felt almost oppressive, a weight pressing down on me, demanding my attention. And then, in the depths of the night, I heard it. A sound so faint, so soft, it could have been my imagination. A breath, close, too close. I lay still, every muscle tense, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew, without looking, that he was there beside me, his presence filling the room, his silent plea echoing in the stillness. "See me," his voice seemed to whisper from the walls, the words laced with a sorrow that cut through me like a blade. "Remember me." I didn't dare move, didn't dare open my eyes, fearing what I might see. Instead, I lay in the darkness, allowing his presence to wash over me, to fill the empty spaces within me. And as the night wore on, I realized that he was no longer just a shadow, a memory. He was a part of me now, an indelible mark left by a life that refused to fade. In that moment, I understood that Edwin would not leave, not while his story remained untold, his existence unacknowledged. He had anchored himself to me, a silent witness bound by a shared solitude. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, casting a faint glow across the room, I knew that my life, like Edwin's, had become something else entirely. A story woven with shadows, a life intertwined with the unseen. Days turned to weeks, and life in the house became an unsettling rhythm, one punctuated by Edwin's quiet, persistent presence. There was an unspoken agreement between us now, a shared understanding that, for reasons unknown, we were tied to one another. He was no longer merely a memory or a shadow in the corner. He had become a constant, invisible companion, guiding me, urging me towards something unnamed, some truth just beyond reach. There were moments, brief but sharp, when I felt almost as if I knew him. I could sense his habits, his movements, as though they had become my own. The way he would linger by the window in the afternoon, watching the world with a look of longing. The way he would retreat to the hallway corner, waiting, always waiting, his presence thick with anticipation. I was losing myself to him, piece by piece, caught in the lure of his forgotten life. One evening, as I was tidying the living room, I caught sight of something strange. A faint mark on the floorboards by the far wall, a spot I hadn't noticed before. Kneeling down, I brushed my fingers over the mark and felt a shiver run through me. It was an impression, a small, almost imperceptible dent, as though someone had stood there, day after day, for years. I traced its outline with my fingertips, feeling the indent deepen beneath my touch. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I felt his presence more strongly than ever. It was as though he were standing behind me, just out of sight, watching, waiting. And for the first time, I felt compelled to speak to him. "Why are you still here, Edwin?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the heavy silence. "What do you want from me?" There was no response, of course, only the thick, unyielding quiet. But somehow, I felt as though he'd heard me, as though my words had reached him across the vast divide that separated the living from whatever realm he now occupied. And in that silence, I felt a strange kind of comfort, a sense that he was not as alone as he had once been. But then, as the hours wore on, that comfort began to shift, to warp into something darker, something almost oppressive. I felt a weight settle over me, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was as though he were pressing himself against me, demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged in a way that went beyond mere memory. I tried to stand, to break free of his grasp, but I found that I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, bound by an invisible force that seemed to pulse with Edwin's presence, his need, his relentless desire to be remembered. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and I felt a wave of fear rise within me. "Edwin," I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "Please, let me go." The pressure eased, just a little, and I gasped for breath, feeling his presence retreat, though not entirely. He was still there, lingering, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a silent reminder of the bond we now shared. Over the next few days, I began to notice other changes. The house itself seemed to shift, as though it were reshaping itself around Edwin's memory. The walls grew darker, the air heavier, filled with a sense of waiting, of anticipation. It was as though the house itself had become a vessel for his presence, a place where his life and mine had become intertwined. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading across my chest, as though someone were pressing their hand against my heart. It was Edwin, I was certain of it, reaching out to me, binding himself to me in a way that went beyond mere memory or shadow. And as I drifted into sleep, I felt a deep, bone-deep weariness settle over me, as though I were carrying not only my own life, but his as well. In my dreams, I saw him, standing in the hallway, his face obscured by shadow, his eyes dark and unreadable. He looked at me, his expression filled with a strange mix of sorrow and relief, as though he had finally found what he'd been searching for. and as I reached out to him, I felt a cold, unyielding presence settle over me, binding us together in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. When I awoke, I knew that things could never go back to the way they were. I was bound to Edwin now, in a way that went beyond simple memory or shadow. He was a part of me, a silent presence woven into the fabric of my life, his story etched into my very soul. And as I looked around the room, at the walls that seemed to pulse with his presence, I realized that I was no longer alone. I had become his keeper, his witness, the one who would remember him when the world had forgotten. And in that moment, I understood that he would never leave, not while I remained in this house, bound to him by a shared solitude that defied the boundaries of life and death. The realization settled over me with the weight of inevitability. I was not merely living in this house. I had become a part of its essence, an unwilling custodian to the fragments Edwin had left behind. The idea was haunting, but somehow I felt resigned. There would be no return to the life I once had. I would stay, bound to the silence, my purpose aligned with Edwin's. I was his witness, his echo, his sole connection to the world he no longer inhabited. But the house wasn't finished with me yet. A few days later, as I dusted the shelves in the living room, my hand brushed against a hidden edge beneath the mantel. I crouched down, squinting at what looked like a loose panel. I gently pried it open, feeling the age of the wood give way with a slight creak, revealing a tiny, dusty alcove inside. There, nestled within the dark recess, was a bundle of faded letters tied with a brittle, fraying string. I held my breath, reaching in and carefully pulling the letters out. They were worn, delicate to the touch, with Edwin's name scrawled across the first page in a trembling hand. My heart pounded as I unfolded the paper, and I could almost feel his presence standing beside me, watching as I uncovered his hidden life. The letters revealed fragments of a forgotten world, relationships and memories that had vanished into the crevices of time. They spoke of regrets, of sorrow, and of an undying loneliness that had settled over him, much like it had begun to settle over me. And as I read, I understood that Edwin had been more than a shadow. He had been a man, a presence who yearned to be remembered, not as a specter but as someone who had lived, who had felt deeply, who had suffered in silence. By the time I finished the last letter, I was trembling. I realized that this was what he had wanted all along. Not to haunt, not to frighten, but to share his story, to leave some imprint on a world that had erased him. He had stayed behind, clinging to his house, his memory, not out of anger but out of the quiet, desperate hope that someone, someday, would see him, would remember him as he was. I placed the letters back in their hidden alcove, feeling a sense of completion settle over me. The weight of Edwin's presence grew lighter, less oppressive, as though he had finally been freed. I sat back, watching as the room seemed to breathe, its shadows softening, its silence filling with a strange sense of peace. That night, for the first time since we'd moved in, I slept soundly. The house was quiet, free of the strange sounds and shifting shadows that had once plagued me. It was as though Edwin had finally let go, his story told, his memory preserved. In the morning, I felt the urge to leave, to step out into the world beyond the walls that had held us both captive. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see his shadow lingering there, watching me go. But there was nothing, only the soft morning light filtering through the windows, casting gentle shadows that felt warm and familiar. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, feeling as though I had been released from a long, quiet vigil. And as I walked away from the house, I knew that Edwin's story would stay with me, a part of my own. I was free, but I would carry his memory, his presence, wherever I went. A reminder that we are all more than the shadows we leave behind.